Hey guys, tonight we are delving into a rather overlooked, and frankly, somewhat hairy aspect of the Great War. Forget grand strategy and trench warfare for a moment, and picture instead the stiff upper lips of early 20th century gentlemen, adorned with an astonishing variety of mustaches. We're going to gently unravel the Great World War I mustache debate, and its surprisingly significant military impact. You're probably picturing impressive, well-waxed handlebars, and you'd be right. But you probably wouldn't enjoy the sheer faff involved in maintaining such elaborate facial furniture, especially in a muddy trench with limited access to a mirror, let alone a decent pot of mustache wax. It wasn't exactly a wash-and-go situation for the discerning Edwardian soldier. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support helps this little corner of historical slumber reach more curious minds. And, as always, do let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a treat to see our global community settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to the early 1900s, the Edwardian era in Britain, or the Belle Époque in France, a time of relative peace and prosperity in Europe, but also an age where outward appearances, particularly for men, were governed by rather strict, if often unspoken, rules. And central to the masculine ideal of this period was facial hair, specifically the mustache. A bare upper lip on an adult man, especially one in a position of authority or in military service, was often seen as boyish, even slightly suspect. The mustache was a symbol of maturity, of virility, of social standing. Stroll down a bustling London street in, say, 1910. Look at the men around you. The city gentleman on his way to the stock exchange sports a neatly trimmed, professional-looking mustache. The policeman on the corner has a robust, regulation-approved set of whiskers. The soldier in his smart red tunic, parading outside Buckingham Palace, boasts a magnificent, often elaborately styled affair. Even the working man, the factory hand or the shop assistant, would likely cultivate some form of upper lip adornment, perhaps less grand, but present nonetheless. Beards had been popular in the Victorian era, but by the early 20th century, the full beard was declining in fashion, replaced by the more focused, more modern, statement of the mustache. This wasn't just a civilian fashion, it was deeply ingrained in military culture across Europe and beyond. For soldiers and officers, the mustache was often more than just a personal preference. It was practically a requirement, a visual signifier of their martial status and authority. Think of the iconic images of military leaders from this period: Lord Kitchener with his formidable, pointing mustache on the famous recruitment poster, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany with his dramatic, upward twirling, Kaiserbart, French generals with their Gallic walruses or elegant handlebars. These weren't accidental. They were carefully cultivated images of power and command. Historians still ponder why exactly the mustache, as opposed to other forms of facial hair like beards or sideburns, became so universally emblematic of military masculinity in this specific era. Was it a practical consideration, easier to maintain than a full beard with high military collars, or was it purely a prevailing aesthetic preference that became codified? The styles were incredibly varied, reflecting national tastes and individual flair. There was the English mustache, typically neat and parted. The handlebar, with its upward curving ends, requiring dedicated waxing and shaping. The walrus, thick and bushy, drooping over the lip. The toothbrush, a small, neat rectangle under the nose, which would later be infamously associated with figures like Charlie Chaplin and, unfortunately, Adolf Hitler, but was a fairly common style before then. Each style had its devotees, and the grooming and maintenance of these mustaches could be a time-consuming ritual, involving special combs, brushes, waxes, and even mustache trainers worn at night to keep them in shape. One quirky tidbit is the existence of mustache cups, teacups with a special ledge or guard built in to protect a gentleman's elaborately waxed mustache from being dunked in his tea or coffee. Imagine the horror of a drooping, tea-sodden handlebar. It was a serious business. For the average soldier, the regimental sergeant major would likely have very definite views on the correct and soldierly appearance of a mustache. It needed to be neat, tidy, and conform to regulations, which often specified that the upper lip must be covered but the mustache must not extend below the corners of the mouth, or some similar precise prescription. Shaving the rest of the face was, of course, mandatory. A clean-shaven chin and cheeks, topped by a well-maintained mustache, was the epitome of smart military turnout. So, as Europe drifted towards the cataclysm of 1914, its armies were, by and large, impressively mustachioed. It was a visual shorthand for soldierly virtue, a furry badge of honor. Little did these men, carefully tending their walruses and handlebars, realize that their prized facial adornments were about to face an unprecedented challenge not from enemy bullets, initially, but from the mud, the lice, and most critically, the insidious, creeping horror of poison gas. The Great War was about to ask some very uncomfortable questions about the practicality, and indeed the safety, of the magnificent military mustache. The great shave-off was, unknowingly, just around the corner. As Europe's armies mobilized in the summer of 1914, it wasn't just men and material heading to the front. It was also a deeply entrenched culture of military grooming, with the mustache at its very heart. You're now peering into the barracks and parade grounds of Britain, Germany, France, and beyond, where the cultivation of proper facial hair was not merely a suggestion, but often a matter of strict military regulation. In the British Army, for example, King's Regulations, the rulebook governing almost every aspect of military life, had, for many years, specific stipulations regarding facial hair. While the exact wording changed over time, the general principle was clear. Soldiers were expected to be clean-shaven, except for a mustache. In fact, for a significant period leading up to and into the early stages of World War I, it was actually against regulations for a British soldier to be clean-shaven on the upper lip unless he was physically unable to grow a mustache. If you could grow one, you were generally expected to have one. This wasn't just about fashion, it was tied to ideas of maturity, discipline, and a soldierly appearance. A young recruit, barely able to sprout a few whiskers, might look forward to the day he could cultivate a proper, regimental, stache, a sign that he was a fully fledged soldier. Imagine a young private, perhaps just enlisted, standing nervously before his company's sergeant major, a man whose own mustache might be a thing of perfectly waxed and bristling legend. The RSM's critical eye would assess not just the shine on the private's boots or the press of his tunic, but also the state of his upper lip. An untidy or unkempt mustache would earn a sharp rebuke. A failure to cultivate one, if capable, might lead to extra duties or pointed remarks about looking like a beardless boy. The pressure to conform was immense. These regulations weren't unique to the British. Similar rules, or at least strong unwritten traditions, existed in many other European armies. In the German army, the variety of mustaches was perhaps even more pronounced, with styles ranging from the formidable Kaiserbart, favored by Wilhelm II himself, to more modest, but still present, mustaches among the rank and file. French soldiers, the poilus, literally hairy ones, though this referred more to their beards in earlier conflicts and their generally rugged appearance, also had a strong tradition of mustaches, often seen as a sign of Gallic virility. Even in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, With its diverse array of nationalities, the mustache was a common, if not always universally mandated, feature of military appearance. The reasons behind these regulations are a fascinating mix of tradition, perceived professionalism, and perhaps even a touch of psychology. A mustache was thought to add an air of fierceness or gravitas to a soldier's appearance, making him look more intimidating to an enemy and more reassuring to his own side. It was part of the smart soldier aesthetic, along with a pressed uniform and polished equipment. Historians still ponder why exactly these regulations persisted so strongly into the 20th century, even as other aspects of military life were modernizing. Was it simple inertia, a reluctance to change long-standing traditions, or did military leaders genuinely believe that a mustachioed army was a more effective fighting force? One quirky tidbit is the sheer effort that went into maintaining these mustaches according to regulation, especially for officers or NCOs who set the standard. They might employ special brushes, combs, waxes, sometimes scented, and even small, spring-loaded, mustache trainers, worn at night to encourage the hairs to grow in the desired direction or to maintain a particular shape, like an impressive upward curl. There were even tales of soldiers using boot polish and a pinch to darken a pale or patchy mustache to make it look more substantial, though one imagines this wasn't a particularly comfortable or healthy practice. The enforcement of these rules could be quite strict. A soldier appearing on parade with an inadequately groomed mustache, or, heaven forbid, having shaved it off without permission, unless for a verified medical reason, could find himself on a charge. It seems almost comical from our modern perspective, where facial hair is largely a matter of personal choice, but in the rigid, hierarchical world of the pre-World War I military, it was taken very seriously. So, as these meticulously mustachioed armies marched off to what they thought would be a short, glorious war, they carried with them not just their rifles and bayonets, but also a deeply ingrained set of beliefs about what a soldier should look like. The mustache was a key part of that identity. It was a symbol of their profession, their manliness, their readiness for battle. The idea that this very symbol of martial pride might soon become a dangerous liability, a hindrance to survival in the face of a new and terrifying form of warfare, would have been almost inconceivable to them. The bristling upper lips of Europe's armies were about to face their sternest test. As the armies of Europe marched to war in 1914, their ranks were bristling not just with bayonets, but with an impressive array of mustaches, each style often reflecting national pride or the personal elan of its wearer. You're now taking a stroll through a kind of rogues gallery of iconic and influential military mustache styles of the era, facial adornments that defined the look of command and soldierly virtue before the grim realities of trench warfare began to challenge their practicality. Perhaps the most instantly recognizable and influential military mustache of the period was the Kaiserbart, the Kaiser's mustache sported by none other than Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. This was a dramatic, theatrical affair, with the ends meticulously waxed and turned sharply upwards, sometimes almost reaching his eyebrows. It was a statement of imperial power, of aggressive confidence, and it was widely imitated, not just within the German military, but by ambitious men across Europe who wished to project a similar air of authority and dynamism. Maintaining such a creation required considerable effort, daily waxing, and possibly even a special nighttime apparatus to keep it in shape. It was less a mustache and more a carefully sculpted piece of facial architecture. Across the English Channel, British officers and NCOs favored a variety of styles, but a common and highly regarded look was the handlebar mustache. This could range from a modest, neatly trimmed curve to a more flamboyant, wider sweep, its ends waxed to crisp points or gentle upward curls. It suggested a certain dashing, devil-may-care attitude, particularly popular among cavalry officers and younger NCOs. Think of the classic image of a British sergeant major, his voice like gravel, his handlebar mustache quivering with indignation or impeccably still on parade. Lord Kitchener's famous recruitment poster featured him with a formidable, if slightly less flamboyant, version of substantial, businesslike mustache that conveyed authority and determination. French military mustaches, or mustaches à la Gauloise, often had a slightly different character. While handlebars were certainly present, you also saw thicker, more natural-looking styles, sometimes verging on the walrus, conveying a sense of rugged, Gallic masculinity. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief at the start of the war, sported a very substantial, almost bushy white mustache that seemed to underscore his image as Papa Joffre, the stolid, reassuring leader. The poilu, the ordinary French soldier, might have a less perfectly groomed but equally cherished mustache, a symbol of his virility and fighting spirit. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with its melting pot of ethnicities, mustache styles could be incredibly diverse. You might see the sweeping mustaches popular among Hungarian hussar officers, reminiscent of their Magyar ancestors, alongside more neatly trimmed Germanic styles, or the more robust mustaches favored by Slavic soldiers. Emperor Franz Joseph I himself, who had reigned for decades, wore distinctive Franz Joseph whiskers, long sideburns that connected to a mustache, but with a clean-shaven chin, a style that was perhaps a bit old-fashioned by 1914 but still iconic. Even further afield, in the Russian Imperial Army, mustaches were de rigueur for officers and many enlisted men. Tsar Nicholas II wore a neat, relatively modest mustache, often emulated by his officers. The image of the Russian soldier often included a fairly substantial mustache, sometimes accompanied by a beard, though regulations usually required beards to be kept trimmed. One quirky tidbit is the incredible array of products marketed specifically for mustache grooming in the pre-war era. There were countless brands of mustache wax, pomade hongroise, for an extra stiff hold, fixateur, for a more natural look, special tiny combs and brushes, mustache scissors with curved blades, and even mustache protectors, small guards, as we mentioned, used while sleeping or eating to prevent the carefully sculpted creation from being disarranged. It was a veritable industry, catering to the hairy upper lips of a generation. The choice of mustache style wasn't always just personal preference. It could also be influenced by regimental tradition. Some regiments, particularly cavalry units with a long and dashing history, might have an unwritten code favoring a particular type of flamboyant mustache. A young officer joining such a regiment would be expected to cultivate the appropriate facial hair as part of fitting in. Historians still ponder whether specific mustache styles were thought to correlate with particular martial virtues. For example, did an upward sweeping mustache genuinely project more aggression or confidence in the eyes of contemporaries? These mustaches were more than just facial hair. They were statements of identity, symbols of rank, and affirmations of a particular kind of early 20th century masculinity. They were grown with pride, groomed with care, and worn as badges of honor. As these men, with their kaisers, handlebars, and walruses, marched off to the sound of brass bands and cheering crowds, they could not have imagined that the very nature of the coming war would soon make these cherished symbols of soldierly pride not just impractical, but potentially lethal. The age of the magnificent military mustache was, unknowingly, drawing to a close, about to collide head-on with the grim, muddy, and gas-choked realities of the Western Front. The grand, meticulously styled mustaches that marched off to war in the optimistic summer of 1914 soon collided with a reality far removed from the neat parade grounds and comfortable barracks they were used to. You're now slogging through the developing trench systems of the Western Front, late 1914, early 1915. The initial war of movement has ground to a halt, replaced by a static, attritional struggle in a landscape rapidly dissolving into mud, filth, and misery. And for the glorious military mustache, this new environment posed a series of rather undignified challenges. The first and most pervasive enemy of the well-groomed stache was mud. The trenches, especially in Flanders, became infamous for their clinging, ubiquitous mud, a vile, porridge-like concoction of clay, water, and human and animal waste. It got everywhere. On your boots, your uniform, your food, your hands, and inevitably on your face. Imagine trying to maintain a perfectly waxed handlebar or a voluminous walrus when you're living in a ditch that's more often than not a quagmire. The waxes and pomades that kept those magnificent creations in shape back home were useless against the constant damp and dirt. Mustaches became matted, bedraggled, and caked with mud. The smart, soldierly appearance so prized on the parade ground was almost impossible to maintain. Then there were the lice. Body lice, or cooties, as the soldiers called them, thrived in the unhygienic conditions of the trenches. They infested clothing, blankets, and hair, including facial hair. A bushy mustache could become a haven for these unwelcome guests, leading to constant itching and discomfort. While soldiers developed various rudimentary methods for delousing their clothes, often by running a lit candle along the seams, keeping a large mustache free of lice would have been an ongoing, and likely losing, battle. Historians still ponder the precise impact of such infestations on troop morale, but it's safe to say that constant itching, on top of all the other miseries, did little to improve a soldier's disposition. Food, too, posed a challenge for the elaborately mustachioed. Eating a bowl of bully beef stew or sipping tea in a muddy trench was a messy business at the best of times. For a man with a large, drooping walrus mustache, it was an exercise in frustration. Food particles would get caught in the hairs, leading to a rather unsavory and unhygienic situation. The aforementioned mustache cup was a creature of civilian refinement, certainly not standard issue in the trenches. Soldiers had to make do, often resulting in mustaches that were less than pristine. Access to grooming supplies was another major issue. The waxes, special combs, and scented oils that were readily available back home were luxuries rarely seen at the front. Soldiers might have a basic razor and perhaps a small comb, but the elaborate grooming rituals of the pre-war era were simply unsustainable. The priority was survival, not maintaining a perfectly sculpted upper lip. This lack of grooming tools, combined with the harsh conditions, meant that even the most dedicated mustache aficionado would struggle to keep his facial hair in good order. One quirky tidbit from this early period is the way soldiers tried to adapt. Some might trim their mustaches to a more manageable, if less impressive, size. Others might try to protect them as best they could, perhaps by tying them up or covering them with a scarf when not on duty, though this would have been impractical during active operations. There are anecdotal accounts of soldiers using things like rifle grease or even candle wax in a desperate attempt to keep their mustaches in some semblance of order, with predictably uncomfortable and often smelly results. It was a testament to how deeply ingrained the mustache culture was that men would go to such lengths. The sheer physical discomfort of a large, wet, muddy, and possibly lice-infested mustache in the already miserable conditions of trench life began to outweigh the social or military prestige it once conferred. What was once a symbol of pride could easily become a source of irritation and a magnet for dirt and vermin. While the official regulations regarding mustaches might still have been technically in force, the practicalities of life at the front were starting to dictate a different reality. This was, however, just the beginning of the mustache's woes. The mud, lice, and general filth were an inconvenience, a blow to pride and comfort. But a far more serious threat was looming, a threat that would turn the magnificent military mustache from a mere inconvenience into a genuine life-or-death liability. The first widespread use of poison gas was just around the corner, and it would force a brutal reckoning for the hairy upper lips of Europe's armies. The great mustache debate was about to take a very sinister turn. The early discomforts of mud and lice were merely inconvenient precursors to the far more serious threat that would confront the mustachioed soldiers of World War I. You are now on the Western Front, April 22, 1915, near the Belgian city of Ypres. The air is still, the usual cacophony of battle perhaps a little muted. Then, something new, something terrifying, begins to drift across no man's land. A sickly greenish-yellow cloud. This is the first large-scale use of chlorine gas by the German army, and it marks a horrifying turning point in the war, and a critical moment for the military mustache. The initial gas masks, if you could even call them that, were rudimentary in the extreme. Soldiers were often issued with simple cotton pads soaked in chemicals like sodium thiosulfate or bicarbonate of soda, which they were supposed to hold over their mouths and noses. These offered minimal protection against the devastating effects of chlorine, which attacked the respiratory system, causing choking, blindness, and agonizing death. As the cloud enveloped the Allied trenches at Ypres, panic ensued. Soldiers, gasping for breath, their eyes streaming, either fled in terror or succumbed where they stood. It quickly became apparent that these basic pads were woefully inadequate. More sophisticated gas respirators began to be developed and issued, but this is where the magnificent military mustache ran into a serious, life-threatening problem. Early respirators, like the British hypo helmet, essentially a flannel bag soaked in anti-gas chemicals, with a mica eyepiece pulled over the head, or the later small box respirator, SBR, relied on creating an airtight seal against the face to be effective. If the seal was compromised, poison gas could seep in, rendering the respirator useless. And what was one of the primary culprits for breaking that crucial seal? You guessed it, a bushy, well-waxed, or voluminous mustache. The hairs of a substantial mustache, especially a stiffly waxed one, would prevent the soft rubber or fabric face piece of the respirator from conforming snugly to the skin around the mouth and nose. Even a small gap could be fatal. A soldier might think he was protected, only to find himself gasping and choking as chlorine or phosgene seeped in around the edges of his proud facial adornment. Imagine the grim irony. The very symbol of soldierly pride and martial virility was now actively working against the soldier's survival. That carefully cultivated handlebar, that impressive walrus, was now a potential death sentence. This wasn't just a matter of discomfort or untidiness anymore. It was a matter of life and breath. The problem was particularly acute with the more structured respirator designs that became standard as the war progressed. The small box respirator, for example, which became the mainstay for British and Commonwealth troops, had a rubberized fabric facepiece with a mouthpiece and nose clip inside. The facepiece needed to seal tightly against the cheeks, chin, and crucially, the area above the upper lip. A large mustache directly interfered with this. Historians still ponder why exactly the initial designs of these respirators didn't more explicitly account for the near-universal presence of mustaches in the armies of the day. Was it an oversight in the rush to develop protection, or was it assumed that soldiers would simply have to adapt? One quirky, and rather grim, tidbit is that soldiers quickly learned to try and improve the seal of their respirators in any way they could. Some might try to flatten their mustaches down with water or saliva just before donning their masks, hoping to create a better seal. Others might try to tuck the mustache inside the facepiece, though this was often uncomfortable and not always effective. The desperate measures men took in those first terrifying gas attacks, fumbling with unfamiliar equipment, while choking on poison, are hard to imagine. The realization of this critical problem, mustaches versus gas mask seals, spread through the ranks and up the chain of command, though perhaps not as quickly as the gas clouds themselves. Medical officers, engineers designing the respirators, and commanders responsible for the safety of their men all began to grapple with this hairy dilemma. The evidence was undeniable. Men with large mustaches were more likely to become gas casualties, even when wearing respirators, than their clean-shaven, on the upper lip, that is, comrades. The gas mask itself was an uncomfortable, claustrophobic piece of equipment. The eyepieces would fog up, breathing was difficult, and wearing one for extended periods was exhausting. Adding a leaky seal due to a bushy mustache made an already terrifying experience even more perilous. The Great War had thrown many challenges at the traditional soldier, but the advent of poison gas, and its direct conflict with the cherished military mustache, was one of the most personal and insidious. A choice was looming: your mustache, or your life. The order to shave, or at least drastically trim, was not far behind. The dawning realization that a magnificent mustache could be a death sentence in a gas attack sent a ripple of concern, and then alarm, through the military high commands. You're now in the slightly less muddy, but no less anxious, corridors of power, where generals, medical officers, and equipment designers are grappling with this bristly problem. The safety of their soldiers was paramount, at least in theory, and if facial hair was compromising the effectiveness of life-saving gas respirators, then something had to be done. Orders from on high were inevitable. Across the Allied armies, and indeed among the Central Powers as well, as both sides were using gas and facing similar issues with respirator seals, official directives began to be issued regarding facial hair in the context of gas warfare. These weren't always outright bans on mustaches, at least not initially, but they strongly emphasized the need for a clean seal between the gas mask face piece and the skin. In the British Army, for instance, official memorandums and training pamphlets started to include specific instructions. Soldiers were told that their respirators must fit snugly, and that any facial hair interfering with this seal needed to be removed. The language was often quite direct. An army order might state something to the effect of, "Mustaches, if worn, must be kept short and trimmed so as not to interfere with the adjustment of the respirator. No portion of the hair should be under the face piece." This was a significant shift from the pre-war regulations that often mandated mustaches. Now, the emphasis was on practicality and safety over tradition. Imagine the scene during gas mask drill. A stern-faced NCO, perhaps himself sporting a newly trimmed, more modest stache, would inspect his men as they donned their small box respirators. He'd be checking for any telltale gaps, any signs that a bushy mustache was preventing a proper seal. A soldier whose magnificent handlebar was clearly causing a problem would be ordered to trim it, or even shave it off completely from the area where the mask sealed. There was little room for sentiment when lives were at stake. The French and German armies issued similar directives. The focus was universally on ensuring that the respirator, the soldier's primary defense against an agonizing death by gas, could function as intended. Medical officers played a key role in advocating for these changes, presenting evidence from gas casualty reports that linked improper seals, often due to facial hair, with higher rates of injury or death. Historians still ponder the exact timeline and consistency of these orders across different armies and different fronts. Did some units or commanders implement them more rigorously or earlier than others, based on their direct experience with gas attacks? One quirky tidbit is the level of detail some of these orders went into. They might specify exactly how much of the upper lip needed to be clear, or recommend particular styles of trimming that were deemed gas mask compatible. The classic toothbrush, mustache, a small, neat rectangle directly under the nose, ironically became one of the few styles that could theoretically be accommodated by some respirator designs without significantly compromising the seal, as it didn't extend out to the cheeks where the face piece needed to sit snugly. This, of course, is a purely practical observation and not an endorsement of a style later tainted by its association with one of history's most reviled figures. These orders were not always popular, as we'll explore next, but they were driven by a grim necessity. The casualty figures from major gas attacks were horrific. Anything that could reduce those numbers, even if it meant sacrificing a cherished symbol of military masculinity, had to be considered. The High Command was essentially telling its soldiers that their traditional notions of what a soldier should look like had to take a back seat to the brutal realities of modern chemical warfare. The responsibility for enforcing these orders fell largely on company and platoon-level officers and NCOs. They were the ones who had to convince, or compel, their men to trim or shave their prized mustaches. It would have been an unenviable task, balancing military discipline and the vital need for safety against the deeply ingrained cultural significance of the mustache. So, the word came down from the top: mustaches must not interfere with gas mask seals. This seemingly simple directive set the stage for a quiet but significant struggle in the trenches, a battle between military regulation, soldierly pride, and the ever-present fear of a gas attack. The era of the magnificent, sprawling military mustache was being officially curtailed, one reluctantly trimmed whisker at a time. The orders had been given, the great shave-off, or at least the great trim-down, was about to begin in earnest. The official orders mandating trimmed or shaved upper lips for gas mask safety might have seemed logical, even essential, from the perspective of High Command, but down in the trenches, among the ordinary soldiers, the reaction was often one of reluctance, resentment, and even outright defiance, at least initially. You're now amidst the rank and file, feeling the considerable resistance to parting with those cherished symbols of masculinity and military identity, their mustaches. For many soldiers, their mustache wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a deeply ingrained part of who they were. It symbolized their maturity, their experience, their status as soldiers. To be ordered to shave it off, or even trim it down to a shadow of its former glory, felt like a personal affront, a stripping away of a mark of their manhood. Remember, these men came from an era where a bare upper lip on an adult male was often seen as boyish or effeminate. Being forced to shave could feel like a regression, a loss of face in a very literal sense. Imagine a veteran soldier, a man who had cultivated his impressive walrus or handlebar for years, perhaps through previous campaigns in the colonies or during long years of peacetime service. His mustache was part of his persona, instantly recognizable to his comrades. To now be told that this proud adornment was a liability, that it had to be sacrificed for a piece of newfangled equipment like a gas mask, would have been a bitter pill to swallow. There was a sense that the traditions of soldiering were being eroded by the impersonal, mechanical nature of this new industrial war. The arguments against shaving were varied. Some men genuinely doubted the necessity, perhaps not having yet experienced a major gas attack firsthand, or believing that their particular mustache wouldn't really interfere with the seal. Others clung to the idea that a proper soldier must have a mustache, that shaving it off was somehow unmanly or would bring bad luck. There was also a strong element of habit and personal pride. A man who had spent years carefully grooming and shaping his mustache would not give it up lightly. Historians still ponder the psychological depth of this attachment. Was it purely vanity, or did the mustache serve as a tangible link to a pre-war identity, a sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos? This reluctance wasn't just individual. It could be a collective sentiment within a unit. If a popular NCO or a group of respected old soldiers were resistant to shaving, it could influence the younger recruits. There might be grumbling in the ranks, a quiet, passive resistance to the new orders. Some might try to get away with minimal trimming, hoping it would be enough to satisfy the inspecting officer. One quirky tidbit that highlights this resistance is the circulation of rumors and jokes about the shaving orders. Soldiers might quip that the real reason for the order was not gas masks, but a shortage of mustache wax, or that the generals were simply jealous of their magnificent facial hair. Humor, as always, was a way of coping with unpopular directives and the absurdities of war. There were even songs and poems penned in the trenches lamenting the demise of the military mustache. However, the grim reality of gas warfare was a powerful persuader. As more soldiers witnessed the horrific effects of gas attacks, or experienced the terror of a leaky mask firsthand, the resistance to shaving began to wane. Seeing a comrade choking and dying because his magnificent mustache had compromised his respirator seal was a sobering lesson. Survival, ultimately, trumped tradition and vanity. The fear of an agonizing death by gas was a more potent motivator than the desire to maintain a fashionable upper lip. Even so, the transition wasn't always smooth or immediate. Some officers and NCOs had to be very strict in enforcing the orders, sometimes resorting to disciplinary measures for noncompliance. There are accounts of shaving parades, where men were inspected and those with non-regulation mustaches were ordered to shave or trim them on the spot, often under the critical eye of their superiors. The great mustache debate in the trenches was therefore a complex interplay of tradition, personal pride, military discipline, and the brutal instinct for self-preservation. While the initial reaction to the shaving orders was often one of stubborn resistance, the relentless threat of poison gas gradually wore down this opposition. The magnificent, sprawling mustaches of the pre-war era were slowly, reluctantly, giving way to more modest, gas mask-friendly styles, or even to bare upper lips. The safety of the individual soldier, and the effectiveness of his life-saving equipment, had to take precedence over even the most cherished of hairy traditions. The debate might have lingered in the grumbling of the ranks, but the tide was turning against the great military stache. With the orders to trim or shave mustaches becoming increasingly firm due to the gas threat, the practicalities of facial grooming in the squalid, dangerous conditions of the trenches took on a new urgency. You're now hunkered down in a damp dugout, perhaps during a rare lull in the shelling, witnessing the rather rough and ready world of frontline barbering and the daily battle against stubble and errant whiskers. For the pre-war soldier in barracks, shaving was a daily ritual, performed with a certain degree of care, likely with a cutthroat razor, a shaving brush, soap, and perhaps even a mirror and hot water. In the trenches, such refinements were almost unimaginable luxuries. Hot water was scarce and usually reserved for tea, if available at all. Mirrors were small, often cracked, or non-existent. Shaving soap was a precious commodity, and using a sharp cutthroat razor in a poorly lit, cramped, and often vibrating dugout, due to nearby shell fire, was a recipe for nicks and cuts, which could easily become infected in the unhygienic environment. Despite these challenges, shaving the lower face and neck remained a requirement for most soldiers to maintain some semblance of military smartness and hygiene. But now, with the added imperative of ensuring a good gas mask seal, attention also turned to the upper lip. The tool of choice for most trench shaving was the safety razor, which was becoming more common around this time. Brands like Gillette had been actively marketing their safety razors to soldiers, emphasizing their convenience and safety compared to the traditional straight razor. A soldier might have his own safety razor, or they might be shared within a small group, though the latter increased the risk of skin infections. Razor blades, however, dulled quickly and replacements were not always easy to come by, leading to uncomfortable shaves with blunt blades. Finding a suitable place and time to shave was another challenge. It was often done during daylight hours to make the most of any available light, but this also meant being potentially exposed to sniper fire or sudden shelling. A soldier might prop a small, grimy mirror against the trench wall, using a mess tin lid filled with cold, often muddy water. The lather might be a thin smear of soap, or sometimes nothing at all, a dry shave being a particularly unpleasant but occasionally necessary ordeal. Historians still ponder the sheer resilience of soldiers who maintained these grooming rituals under such appalling conditions. Was it purely for discipline and hygiene, or did these small acts of normalcy provide a psychological anchor in the chaos? For trimming mustaches to comply with gas mask regulations, a small pair of scissors, if a soldier was lucky enough to possess them, would have been invaluable. Otherwise, it might be a case of carefully using the safety razor to shorten the offending whiskers. This required a steady hand and a good deal of care, especially if one was trying to maintain some semblance of a style rather than just hacking it all off. In some units, there might be a designated trench barber, a soldier who had some barbering skills in civilian life, or who was simply handy with a razor and scissors. He would be in high demand, not just for haircuts, which were also essential for hygiene and to prevent lice, but also for shaving and mustache trimming. His salon would be a corner of a dugout, or a sheltered spot in the trench, his tools basic, his clientele caked in mud. Payment might be in the form of a few cigarettes, a share of a food parcel, or simply the gratitude of his comrades. One quirky tidbit is that these trench barbers often became repositories of news and gossip. Much like their civilian counterparts, their impromptu chairs a place for a brief moment of human connection and relative normalcy. The results of these trench grooming efforts were, understandably, often less than perfect. A soldier might emerge from his shaving ordeal with a patchy shave, a few nicks, and a mustache that was more functional than fashionable. But the effort was made, driven by a combination of military discipline, personal pride, and the increasingly urgent need for gas mask safety. The shared experience of struggling with razors and cold water in the mud also fostered a certain camaraderie. Men would help each other out, perhaps lending a precious razor blade or sharing a sliver of soap. There would be jokes and grumbles about the discomfort, about the orders to shave, about the general misery of trench life. These small, shared rituals of daily existence were an important part of coping with the immense stress and hardship of the front line. So, while the magnificent, parade ground mustaches of 1914 were largely a casualty of trench conditions and gas warfare, the daily grind of shaving and trimming continued. It was a constant, personal battle against dirt, discomfort, and the ever-present threat of gas, fought with basic tools and a good deal of soldierly stoicism. The focus had shifted from elaborate style to grim functionality, a clear reflection of how the Great War was reshaping not just armies and empires, but even the very faces of the men who fought it. The Great Mustache Debate, and the subsequent orders to trim or shave for gas mask safety, didn't play out identically across all the warring nations. While the underlying problem, facial hair interfering with respirator seals, was universal, the cultural significance of mustaches, the strictness of pre-war regulations, and the speed of adaptation varied. You're now taking a comparative peek across the trenches, observing the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hairy differences between the Allies and the Central Powers, and even within the Allied coalition itself. In the British Army, as we've seen, the pre-war tradition of the mandatory mustache, if you could grow one, was strong. This made the order to trim or shave for gas safety a particularly noticeable shift. There was significant initial resistance, rooted in that deep sense of soldierly identity tied to the stache. However, the British military, known for its pragmatism when faced with battlefield realities, generally enforced the new gas mask regulations with increasing firmness as the war progressed and gas attacks became more frequent and deadly. The Tommy, in the trenches, while perhaps grumbling about it, largely complied, prioritizing survival. French soldiers, the poilus, also had a strong tradition of mustaches, often seen as a symbol of Gallic flair and virility. Styles like the handlebar, or a more robust, natural growth were common. Like the British, they faced the same imperative to ensure their apéro-respiratoire special, ARS, gas mask sealed properly. While there might have been similar initial reluctance, the French army also moved towards ensuring facial hair didn't compromise safety. The image of the mustachioed poilu remained iconic, but the mustaches themselves likely became more modest and gas mask compatible as the war wore on. What about the American dobas when they arrived in force in 1917 and 1918? American military fashion at the time was perhaps slightly less fixated on the mandatory mustache than in some European armies. While many American officers and soldiers certainly sported mustaches, it wasn't as universally regulated. When they entered the war and began to face the reality of gas attacks, they benefited from the hard-won experience of their British and French allies regarding gas mask discipline. The orders to ensure a clean seal were generally implemented quickly, perhaps with less cultural baggage attached to the mustache than in the longer-serving European armies. Historians still ponder whether the relatively shorter combat experience of the bulk of U.S. forces meant the Great Shave-Off was less of a protracted emotional drama for them compared to British or French veterans who'd had their taches for years of war. On the other side of no man's land, the German army also had a strong mustache tradition. The iconic Kaiserbart of Wilhelm II set a certain tone, and many German soldiers and officers wore impressive mustaches. They, too, developed sophisticated gas masks, the gas mask, and faced the same issue of needing a good facial seal. German military discipline was famously strict, and it's likely that orders regarding trimming or shaving for gas mask safety were implemented with typical German efficiency, though perhaps not without some grumbling from soldiers proud of their traditional Teutonic whiskers. One quirky tidbit is to consider the armies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, multi-ethnic force. Mustache styles varied widely, from the elaborate handlebars of Hungarian cavalry officers to the simpler mustaches of Czech, Polish, or Bosnian infantrymen. Enforcing a universal shaving or trimming policy across such a diverse army, with its myriad languages and local customs, would have presented its own unique challenges for the Austro-Hungarian High Command. Then there are armies from warmer climes or different cultural traditions. For example, Indian troops serving with the British Empire, such as Sikhs, had religious proscriptions against cutting their hair, including beards and mustaches. This posed a very specific challenge for gas mask fitting. Special attempts were made to design respirators that could accommodate beards, or alternative strategies were employed, but it highlighted how a one-size-fits-all approach to facial hair and gas masks was problematic. These situations often required specific, culturally sensitive solutions rather than blanket shaving orders. Even within a single army, there might be differences. For instance, were naval personnel less likely to face gas attacks on the open sea, though not immune, especially with gas shells, under the same pressure to trim their impressive naval staches and beards as their army counterparts in the trenches? Generally, the urgency was highest where the gas threat was most immediate on the Western Front. So, while the problem of mustaches and gas masks was a shared one, the journey from hairy pre-war pride to a more streamlined, safety-conscious upper lip took slightly different paths in different armies. Cultural norms, the strictness of existing regulations, the specific types of gas masks used, and even religious considerations all played a part. However, The overarching trend was clear. The conditions of modern, industrialized warfare, particularly the advent of poison gas, were forcing a significant re-evaluation of a long-standing symbol of military masculinity across all nations involved. The Great War was, in a very real sense, a great leveler of mustaches. The orders to trim or shave mustaches for gas mask safety raised an interesting, and sometimes contentious, question within the hierarchical structure of the military. Did these rules apply equally to all ranks? Or was there a case of posh statues for the officers, plain faces for the enlisted men? You're now peering into the officers' messes and the sergeants' dugouts, observing the nuanced, and occasionally hypocritical, application of these hairy regulations. In theory, military regulations, especially those pertaining to safety, should apply equally to all ranks. An officer's lungs were just as vulnerable to phosgene or mustard gas as a private's. Therefore, logically, anyone who might be exposed to gas and was required to wear a respirator should have ensured their facial hair did not compromise the seal. However, the reality of military life, with its ingrained respect for rank and privilege, sometimes led to a more flexible interpretation of the rules for those higher up the chain of command. Many officers, particularly those of senior rank or from aristocratic backgrounds, had cultivated magnificent mustaches for years. These were not just symbols of military status, but also of social standing. To suddenly be ordered to shave or drastically trim such a well-established facial feature might have been seen as undignified, an affront to their authority. While a company sergeant major could bark at a private to shave his offending whiskers, it was a more delicate matter for a colonel to instruct a major, or a general to advise a colonel, on the state of his upper lip. There are anecdotal accounts and photographic evidence suggesting that some officers, especially those further back from the absolute front line or in staff positions, managed to retain more substantial mustaches than the enlisted men under their command. Perhaps they rationalized it by believing they were less likely to be directly exposed to a gas cloud, or that their rank afforded them some leeway. It's also possible that they were simply less rigorously inspected or less likely to be directly challenged by their subordinates on the matter. Historians still ponder the extent of this discrepancy. Was it a widespread phenomenon, or more a case of isolated instances being highlighted? This potential disparity could, understandably, lead to resentment among the enlisted men. If they were being forced to sacrifice their prized mustaches for safety, while seeing their officers maintain impressive facial hair, it could fuel a sense of one rule for them, another for us. In the grim, egalitarian misery of the trenches, such perceived hypocrisies could be particularly galling. A soldier struggling with a leaky gas mask because he'd been ordered to hack away at his beloved statch might look sideways at an officer whose perfectly waxed handlebars seemed to defy the regulations. One quirky tidbit is the idea of the officer's mustache, evolving as a slightly more permissible, if still somewhat risky, affectation. Perhaps an officer might maintain a neater, more compact style that he believed, rightly or wrongly, offered a better seal than the more sprawling mustaches of the pre-war era, while still retaining a clear marker of his officer status. The toothbrush mustache, while not exclusively an officer style, was compact enough that some who favored it might have argued it didn't interfere significantly with their respirator. However, it's also important not to overgeneralize. Many officers, especially those leading from the front and sharing the dangers of their men, were just as diligent about gas mask discipline for themselves as they were for their troops. They understood the risks and set an example. A good officer knew that his own safety, and his ability to command effectively during a gas attack, depended on his respirator functioning correctly. For these officers, personal vanity or adherence to old traditions would take a back seat to the brutal necessities of war. They trimmed or shaved alongside their men. The situation might also have varied depending on the specific army and its traditions. In armies with a very rigid class structure, the deference to officer privilege might have been more pronounced. In others, with a more egalitarian ethos, the rules might have been applied more uniformly. Furthermore, the type of gas mask could play a role. Some early or specialized respirator designs might have been perceived, rightly or wrongly, by officers as being more accommodating to facial hair, or they might have had access to slightly better quality or custom-fitted masks. Ultimately, while the official orders were generally intended to apply to all, the practical enforcement could be uneven. The question of moustaches versus plain faces was likely a source of some grumbling and wry amusement in the trenches. It highlighted the enduring complexities of rank and privilege, even when faced with a threat as indiscriminate as poison gas. While the trend was undeniably towards less facial hair for everyone at the front, the journey there might have been a little smoother, and the mustache a little more resilient, for some of those with pips on their shoulders. The orders to trim or shave mustaches, while driven by the life-or-death necessity of ensuring a good gas mask seal, didn't just affect a soldier's appearance. They had a surprisingly significant, if often subtle, impact on troop morale. You're now sensing the undercurrents of feeling in the trenches, where the loss of a stache could mean more than just a bare upper lip. It could chip away at a soldier's sense of identity, tradition, and even his fighting spirit, at least for a time. For many soldiers, as we've discussed, the mustache was a potent symbol. It represented maturity, experience, and a certain soldierly elan. It was a connection to a pre-war sense of self, a visual marker of manhood that had been cultivated, often with considerable pride, for years. To be compelled to remove or drastically alter this deeply personal feature could feel like a diminution, a loss of a part of oneself. In the dehumanizing environment of trench warfare, where individuality was constantly suppressed, a distinctive mustache might have been one of the few ways a soldier could express his personality. Losing it could contribute to a feeling of being just another anonymous cog in the vast, brutal machine of war. Imagine the camaraderie of a group of veterans, men who had served together for months or even years, their mustaches perhaps a point of friendly rivalry or shared identity within their platoon or company. The order to shave could disrupt this familiar dynamic. A soldier who had always been known for his magnificent handlebar might suddenly look younger, more vulnerable, almost like a different person to his comrades. This visual change, multiplied across a unit, could subtly alter the social fabric. There was also the connection to tradition. The military mustache was part of a long lineage of soldierly appearance. Forcing its removal could feel like a break with that history, a sign that the old ways of soldiering were being swept aside by the impersonal demands of modern, chemical warfare. For older soldiers, NCOs who had built their careers in a mustachioed army, this could be particularly poignant. It might feel like another piece of their familiar world crumbling away. The psychological impact could be especially acute for men who were self-conscious about their appearance, or who derived a significant amount of confidence from their mustache. To suddenly face the world, and the enemy, with a bare upper lip might make them feel less formidable, less themselves. While it seems a small thing compared to the daily threat of death or injury, these small things can accumulate and affect a soldier's overall mental state. Historians still ponder the cumulative effect of such seemingly minor deprivations on the broader psychological resilience of troops during prolonged trench warfare. One quirky tidbit is that some soldiers, after being forced to shave, might actually report feeling colder or more exposed, even if the physical difference was minimal. The mustache, however symbolic, had provided a certain, perhaps imagined, sense of protection or completeness. Its absence could leave a man feeling oddly vulnerable, both physically and emotionally. Of course, the impact on morale wasn't universally negative or long-lasting. For some, especially younger soldiers who perhaps struggled to grow a decent stash anyway, the order to shave might have been a relief, leveling the playing field. And as the reality of gas attacks became undeniable, the understanding that a clean shave could save one's life would, for most, override any sentimental attachment to their facial hair. Survival is a powerful motivator. However, the initial period of adjustment, the grumbling and the sense of loss, was real. It was another small indignity, another piece of personal autonomy sacrificed to the relentless demands of the war. Commanders and NCOs had to be mindful of this. Enforcing the shaving orders too brusquely, without acknowledging the sentiment attached to the mustaches, could breed unnecessary resentment. A good leader might try to explain the necessity with a touch of empathy, perhaps even sharing a joke about his own sadly diminished stash, to soften the blow. Ultimately, the impact of the Great Shave-Off on morale was likely a temporary dip for most, overshadowed by the larger horrors and stresses of the war. But it serves as a fascinating example of how even seemingly minor aspects of a soldier's appearance and personal identity can be deeply intertwined with their sense of well-being and their willingness to fight. The military mustache, in its rise and fall, tells a small but significant story about the human side of warfare, a reminder that soldiers are not just fighting units, but individuals with their own histories, prides, and yes, even their own beloved facial hair. The war demanded many sacrifices, and the magnificent military stash was, for many, one of them. While soldiers in the trenches were grumbling about their forcibly denuded upper lips, and NCOs were diligently inspecting for gas mask seal compliance, another group of military personnel had their own professional, and often pragmatic, perspective on the great mustache debate: the Army doctors and medical staff. You're now in a field hospital or a regimental aid post, listening to the medic's mustache musings, which were less about style and tradition, and more about hygiene, infection, and the grim realities of treating gas casualties. From a purely medical standpoint, in the context of World War I trench conditions, a large, bushy mustache could be seen as a potential hygiene hazard even before the advent of widespread gas attacks. The trenches were notoriously unsanitary environments, rife with bacteria and vermin. A mustache, especially one that was difficult to keep clean, could harbor dirt, food particles, and, as we've mentioned, lice. This increased the risk of skin infections around the mouth and nose, such as impetigo or folliculitis. While perhaps not life-threatening in themselves, such infections could be uncomfortable, debilitating, and could potentially lead to more serious complications if left untreated in an environment where even minor wounds could quickly turn septic. Army doctors, tasked with maintaining the health and fighting fitness of the troops, would have been well aware of these risks. While they might not have had the authority to order mustaches shaved purely for general hygiene reasons, unless an infection was already present, it would certainly have been a consideration in their overall assessment of soldier health. A clean-shaven face, or at least a very neatly trimmed and easily cleaned mustache, was simply more conducive to good hygiene in the field. Then came poison gas, and the medical perspective shifted dramatically. Doctors in field hospitals and casualty clearing stations were the ones who dealt with the horrific aftermath of gas attacks. They saw firsthand the agonizing suffering of men whose lungs had been seared by chlorine or phosgene, or whose skin was covered in the terrible blisters caused by mustard gas. They understood, with brutal clarity, the absolute necessity of effective respirator use. When it became apparent that mustaches were compromising gas mask seals and leading to increased casualties, the medical corps would have been strong advocates for the new shaving and trimming regulations. Their priority was preventing gas injuries, and if that meant sacrificing facial hair, it was a small price to pay. A doctor treating a man dying from gas poisoning because his magnificent stash had let the fumes and would have had little sympathy for arguments based on tradition or vanity. Historians still ponder the exact role medical lobbying played in the formalization of these shaving orders, but it was undoubtedly significant. Medical evidence of increased casualties among mustachioed men would have carried considerable weight with the high command. One quirky, and rather grim, tidbit from the medical perspective is how they might assess a gas casualty. If a soldier came in suffering from gas inhalation despite claiming to have worn his respirator, one of the first things a medic might check, if the situation allowed, was the fit of his mask and the state of his facial hair. A bushy mustache under a loose-fitting mask would tell its own story. This wasn't about blame, but about understanding the causes of casualties to improve prevention. Furthermore, treating facial wounds or burns, which were common in trench warfare, was often made more complicated by the presence of extensive facial hair. Shaving around a wound to clean it and apply dressings was standard medical practice, and a large mustache could simply get in the way, harboring bacteria and making effective treatment more difficult. Medical officers would also have been involved in the training of soldiers in anti-gas measures, including the proper fitting and wearing of respirators. They would have been the ones demonstrating how to achieve an airtight seal, and emphasizing the importance of a clean-shaven, at least around the mask's edge, face. Their authority as medical professionals would have lent weight to these instructions, perhaps helping to overcome some of the soldiers' reluctance. So, from the medic's point of view, the great mustache debate was less a debate and more a clear-cut issue of public health and casualty prevention. While they might have respected a soldier's attachment to his stash on a personal level, their professional duty was to advocate for measures that would save lives and reduce suffering. In the grim calculus of war, a clean upper lip, ensuring a functioning gas mask, was infinitely preferable to a magnificent mustache accompanied by a pair of poisoned lungs. Their perspective, born from the daily confrontation with the horrific consequences of gas warfare, was a powerful voice in favor of the great shave-off. As the realities of gas warfare and the ensuing regulations took hold, the magnificent, sprawling mustaches of the pre-war era began a noticeable decline in the trenches. But did this mean the complete eradication of the military stash? Not entirely. Instead, you begin to see the emergence, or perhaps the increased prominence, of smaller, more practical, and arguably more gas mask-friendly mustache styles. Was this a conscious evolution, a deliberate adaptation to the new rules of war, or simply a side effect of a less hirsute era? The most obvious casualty was the large, bushy walrus mustache and the extensively waxed, wide-spreading handlebar. These styles, which relied on significant bulk and often extended well onto the cheeks or below the corners of the mouth, were simply incompatible with achieving an airtight seal with a respirator like the small box respirator. Orders to trim the hair, so as not to be under the face piece, directly targeted these more voluminous creations. A soldier ordered to make his walrus gas mask compatible would essentially have to trim it down to a much smaller, neater version, or shave the offending portions off entirely. What kind of styles remained, or emerged, as regulation-friendly? The toothbrush mustache, that small, neat rectangle directly under the nose, is often cited. Because it was typically confined to the area of the philtrum, the groove between the nose and the upper lip, and didn't usually extend much beyond the width of the nostrils, it could theoretically sit entirely within the inner boundary of a gas mask's face-piece seal, or at least interfere less than a wider style. While this style existed before the war, some historians suggest its prevalence may have increased, or it was at least one of the few styles that could plausibly be argued as safe by those determined to retain some form of upper lip adornment. Of course, Its later association with Adolf Hitler has made it retrospectively notorious, but during World War I, it was just one of several smaller stash options. Another style that might have persisted, or been adapted, was a very neatly trimmed, short, English style mustache, kept strictly to the upper lip and not extending downwards or too far sideways. Think of a very modest, clipped stash, perhaps only a finger's width, that could be easily flattened or that wouldn't significantly break the respirator's seal. The key was keeping the hair off the parts of the face where the rubber or fabric of the mask needed to make firm contact with the skin. It's a matter of some debate among historians whether these smaller styles became popular because of gas mask regulations, or if their rise was part of a broader societal trend towards less elaborate facial hair that was simply accelerated or made more acute by the war. Fashion, even in wartime, is a complex thing. However, the direct, functional pressure exerted by gas mask design undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping what was considered acceptable, or at least permissible, on the upper lips of soldiers at the front. One quirky tidbit is the idea of the phantom mustache. Some soldiers, having been forced to shave a long-cherished stash, might report feeling its absence for weeks or even months afterwards, a kind of phantom limb sensation but for facial hair. They might still instinctively go to stroke it or adjust it, only to find bare skin. This speaks to how deeply ingrained the mustache was as part of their physical identity. It's also important to note that gas mask compatible didn't necessarily mean completely safe. Even a small mustache, if not perfectly positioned or if the mask wasn't donned correctly, could potentially compromise the seal. The safest option, from a purely technical standpoint, was a completely clean-shaven upper lip in the area where the mask sealed. But for men desperate to retain some vestige of their stash, these smaller, neater styles offered a compromise, a way to, hopefully, satisfy both the regulations and their personal desire for facial hair. The visual landscape of the trenches began to change. Group photographs from the early war years often show a veritable forest of impressive mustaches. By 1917 or 1918, while mustaches hadn't vanished entirely, they were generally smaller, less flamboyant, and more uniform in their modesty. The glorious individualism of pre-war mustachery was giving way to a more streamlined, functional look, dictated by the grim necessities of chemical warfare. So, while the order wasn't necessarily, all mustaches must go, it was certainly, all mustaches that interfere with your gas mask must go, or be severely curtailed. This led to a kind of sartorial natural selection on the upper lip. The big, bushy, and elaborate were culled, while the small, neat, and unobtrusive had a better chance of surviving the cut both literally and figuratively. The World War I mustache wasn't dead, but it was definitely undergoing a significant and life-saving haircut. While orders from high command and the advice of medical officers played a significant role in the great mustache debate, perhaps the most potent persuader for a soldier to trim or shave his beloved stash was the direct, terrifying, and often agonizing experience of a poison gas attack, or witnessing its effects on his comrades. You are now in the aftermath of such an attack, the acrid smell still lingering, the sounds of choking and moaning filling the air. It's in these moments that abstract regulations became stark, undeniable realities. Imagine a soldier, let's call him Private Smith, who had been fiercely proud of his magnificent handlebar mustache. He perhaps resisted the initial orders to trim it, believing it part of his soldierly identity. Or maybe he just hadn't taken the threat seriously enough. Then comes the gas alarm, the shout of, "Gas! Gas! Quick, boys!" The frantic sounding of gongs or rattles. He fumbles for his small box respirator, pulls it on, but in his haste, or because of the sheer bulk of his stash, he doesn't get a perfect seal. As the greenish-yellow cloud of chlorine, or the invisible, insidious phosgene envelopes his section of the trench, he starts to feel it. A burning in his throat, a searing pain in his eyes, a tightening in his chest that makes every breath an agony. He claws at his mask, trying to adjust it, but it's too late. The gas is seeping in. He sees his mates, some of whom had perhaps heeded the warnings and sported more modest, gas mask-friendly upper lips, faring better, their respirators holding. His own magnificent stash, once a source of pride, has betrayed him. If Private Smith survives this ordeal, and many didn't, the experience would be a brutal, unforgettable lesson. Lying in a field hospital, his lungs raw, his eyes temporarily blinded, coughing up frothy fluid, the connection between his facial hair and his suffering would be crystal clear. The first thing he would likely do upon recovering enough strength, or upon returning to his unit, would be to demand a razor and remove the offending whiskers. No amount of tradition or personal vanity could outweigh the memory of that agonizing, near-death experience. Even for those who didn't directly suffer a compromised seal, witnessing the effects of gas on others was profoundly impactful. Seeing a comrade, perhaps one who had also been lax about his mustache, gasping for his last breath, his face contorted in agony, was a powerful deterrent against future hirsute carelessness. The word would spread through the platoon. Old Bill copped it bad, his stash let the gas in. Such grim object lessons were far more effective than any printed regulation. Historians still ponder the subtle but powerful role of peer influence and shared trauma in enforcing safety protocols like gas mask discipline, often more effectively than top-down orders. One quirky, and rather tragic, tidbit is the phenomenon of gas fright or gas hysteria. After experiencing or witnessing a gas attack, some soldiers became so terrified of gas that they would imagine its presence even when there was none, or they would obsessively check and recheck their respirator seals. For these men, any facial hair, however slight, might become a source of intense anxiety, leading them to shave meticulously, far beyond what regulations might strictly require. The type of gas also influenced perceptions. While chlorine was terrifying, later gases like phosgene were even more insidious because they could be less immediately irritating, leading soldiers to think their masks were working, only for symptoms to develop hours later, often with fatal consequences. Mustard gas, which attacked the skin as well as the lungs, added another layer of horror, as it could blister any exposed skin, and a poorly sealed mask could allow vapors to affect the face. A clean seal wasn't just about protecting the lungs. It was about protecting the entire face from these horrific chemical agents. So, while the initial orders to trim mustaches might have been met with grumbling or passive resistance, the first-hand, brutal education provided by actual gas attacks rapidly changed minds. The desire to preserve a fashionable or traditional stash faded quickly when weighed against the desire to breathe. The great mustache debate, in many ways, was settled not in the orderly offices of high command, nor in the grumbling sessions in the dugouts, but in the choking, terrifying reality of the gas cloud. Survival became the ultimate arbiter of upper lip fashion. The magnificent military mustache, a proud symbol of a bygone era, was largely gassed out of existence on the Western Front, or at least reduced to a shadow of its former glory, a grim casualty of chemical warfare. As the Great War finally drew to its exhausted close in November 1918, and the soldiers began the slow, often bewildering process of returning to civilian life, what became of the military mustache? Had the brutal necessities of gas warfare and the subsequent great shave-off permanently altered male facial hair trends? You're now observing the post-war landscape, noticing a distinct shift in what adorned the upper lips of a generation that had been through the crucible. The most obvious legacy was the decline of the large, flamboyant mustache styles that had been so prevalent before 1914. The magnificent handlebar, the bushy walrus, the dramatic Kaiserbart, these all began to look decidedly old-fashioned, relics of a more innocent, or perhaps more naive, era. The men returning from the trenches had, for the most part, become accustomed to a more streamlined, practical approach to facial hair, either by being forced to trim their staches drastically for gas mask safety, or by choosing to shave them off entirely for convenience and hygiene in the harsh conditions of the front. This wartime practicality carried over into peacetime. Many veterans, having spent years with a smaller mustache or a bare upper lip, simply didn't bother to regrow their more elaborate pre-war creations. The faff and expense of maintaining a large, waxed stache seemed trivial, even a bit ridiculous, after the life-and-death struggles they had endured. Tastes had changed, shaped by the grim realities of war. A cleaner, more modern look began to prevail. The toothbrush, mustache, that small, neat rectangle under the nose, did enjoy a period of popularity in the 1920s and 30s. As we noted, it was one of the few styles that could, theoretically, be compatible with a gas mask. Its association with figures like Charlie Chaplin also helped its mainstream appeal. However, its later, infamous association with Adolf Hitler would eventually lead to its almost complete disappearance from polite society. Historians still debate whether its wartime practicality directly contributed to its post-war popularity before it became tainted, or if it was simply part of a broader trend towards smaller, neater facial hair. More common among returning servicemen was either a very modest, neatly trimmed mustache often called a military mustache, but much smaller than its pre-war namesake, or, increasingly, a completely clean-shaven upper lip. The latter, which had been somewhat unusual for adult men before the war, became much more socially acceptable, even fashionable, in the post-war years. The safety razor, popularized during the war for its convenience in the trenches, made daily shaving easier and more accessible for the average man. One quirky tidbit is the way wartime experiences sometimes influenced fiction and popular culture. Characters in post-war novels or films depicting the Great War might be shown wrestling with the mustache versus gas mask dilemma, or a veteran character might be portrayed with a small, neat stache or a clean-shaven lip, reflecting the changed norms. The image of the old soldier, with a huge, fierce mustache, began to be replaced by a more modern, less hirsute representation. Of course, the grand military mustache didn't vanish entirely overnight. Some older gentlemen, particularly those who had not served at the front or who were deeply attached to their traditional look, might have retained their impressive facial furniture. And in some very traditional military circles or ceremonial units, a certain style of mustache might still have been encouraged or even required for a time. But overall, the trend was clear. The war had significantly pruned the landscape of male facial hair. The decline of the World War I-era mustache also symbolized a broader shift in society. The war had shattered many of the certainties and traditions of the Edwardian era. The post-war world was, in many ways, a more streamlined, less formal, and perhaps more cynical place. The elaborate, sometimes fussy, grooming rituals associated with the great mustaches of the past seemed out of step with this new reality. So, the Great World War I mustache debate, sparked by the deadly threat of poison gas, had a lasting impact that extended far beyond the trenches. It contributed to a significant and lasting change in male grooming habits and aesthetic preferences. The magnificent military stache, once a proud symbol of martial masculinity, became largely a casualty of modern warfare, a hairy footnote in the history of a conflict that reshaped the world in countless ways, right down to the hair on men's upper lips. The faint scent of bay rum and mustache wax seems to have faded now, replaced by the gentle stillness of your quiet room. We've twirled through the history of the Great War mustache, from its bristling Edwardian grandeur to its reluctant, gas-induced decline. We've seen how a potent symbol of masculinity and military pride clashed with the grim, practical realities of trench warfare and the terrifying advent of poison gas. We imagined the parade grounds, alive with meticulously groomed handlebars and Kaiserbarts, and then descended into the mud and mire of the trenches where such finery became a matted, lice-ridden nuisance. We felt the chilling moment when the greenish clouds of chlorine gas first rolled across no man's land, turning those beloved statues from a point of pride into a potential death trap, compromising the life-saving seal of the early respirators. We heard the orders from on high, the reluctant shaves, the grumbling in the ranks, and the pragmatic musings of army doctors. We saw how different armies, and even different ranks, navigated this hairy dilemma, and how the brutal, first-hand experience of gas attacks became the ultimate persuader. The magnificent military mustache, a hallmark of a bygone era, was largely trimmed, shaved, and gassed out of widespread existence, leaving a legacy of more streamlined, practical upper lips. As you let your thoughts drift now, carried on the soft currents of approaching sleep, perhaps you can appreciate the quiet irony. A conflict of such monumental scale, reshaping empires and redrawing maps, also reached down to something as personal as the hair on a man's face. The Great War left many legacies, and the vanishing war statue is a small, rather curious, but nonetheless telling one. Let the memory of those bristling figures fade into the calm, and allow yourself to sink into a deep and restful peace. The debate is over. The trenches are quiet. All is still.